Good morning, Dan Gutierrez,
Good morning, Marty Keller.
and good morning to our viewers. Welcome to the Intentional Living Podcast. Marty Keller and Dan Gutierrez, our series just exploring the uh, the way of how to create the lives that we want to live. And our podcast is based on or stands upon an old Socratic quote, a quote from Socrates, who said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." And it's part of our human nature, isn't it, to fight the old and as a way of convincing ourselves that we're building the new. Um, but
Correct.
we do have in the intentional living process, we do want to honor what happened to us because that is how we created the defenses that we're dealing with today in our lives. We create the compulsions, we create the hidden behaviors or the behaviors that we can't figure out why they're happening. And one of the things we wanted to talk about today, Dan, is the role of violence in the development of trauma and possibly in, what role does it play in the solution?
Yeah, that's a great thing. It's a good place to start. So yeah, how violence has many different forms. They have many definitions. Um, Violence can be an emotional category. How do I do emotional violence? Many different ways. There's verbal violence. There's physical around violence. Physical direct violence. Um, Physical direct violence is what you see on TV for the most part. Um, People shooting each other, stabbing each other, running over each other over cars,
Video
beating,
games.
exactly. Um, but each form of violence carries an emotional response that goes with it, and that is the lingering impact of any form of violence is the emotional dysfunction created in people or animals or yeah. So getting back to it, emotional violence can be anything from having an addiction, um, um, violating somebody's boundaries on purpose to manipulate them and control them. So for most of us, growing up in a family environment, there's a lot of emotional violence that goes on, and it's if you grow up with it, you have a sense that it's normal. Um, Any form of violence is used to control, manipulate, hurt, put down, intimidate. Um, it's so you can maintain control over somebody else. Um, and it's one of those things is um, violence is also a form of emotional regulation. So when I discharge my energy, my dis my energy into you, I'm actually uh, discharging energy, which in turn I let it go and I give it to you, which is a form of emotional regulation. Um, Another form of emotional regulation is children. You suck your thumb, right? That's a form of emotional regulation. But violence is done on purpose with the intent to control or manipulate someone. You cannot do violence to someone or yourself without an emotional response. That's the reason people use violence is that it creates an emotional response that people feel, and the to the extent that they feel fear, intimidation, dismissal. That's the tool. That's the energy that people who are doing violence to other people use as leverage to get what they want. So for me, the what was yeah for me It's how I do the emotional violence to myself to manipulate and coerce myself into behavior that has been programmed into me from my family of origin. Um,
So just to
I,
just to create clarity for the newcomer, that what I heard you say is that emotional violence is not only done toward others for the purpose of manipulation and control, but it's also done to ourselves.
correct.
That we do emotional violence in all directions. And we're talking here about emotional violence about which we're probably not conscious,
Right.
initially.
In the beginning, it's rather, one way I tell people it's like emotional violence to yourself, right? What we're talking about here is not to blame anybody or judge anybody, but is to create awareness around the behavior. If I don't have awareness of what I'm doing, I can't become accountable for it. If I don't become accountable for it, the likelihood of me creating change is goes way down. So if I
Yeah.
understand that, my addiction is something, is something that I do that harms me. That's it, whether I intended to do that or not, I'm still doing it, and that's a form of emotional violence to myself. No blame, no judgment. Um,
Yeah, so
but
just if I could, Dan, thanks. Just to clarify for the newcomer, this what Dan just talked about, that's the heart of our practice, and we call it accountability because we want to just be able to account for, to name the behavior and the feelings behind it without blame or judgment. Because if I get trapped in blame and judgment, that's a form of emotional violence, isn't it?
well, it's one of those things. The answer is yes. And until I create awareness around things, um, it's could blaming somebody for the fact that they don't know that something is violent and they're doing it to themselves. Uh, that that's a that would be doing a form of emotional violence,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Blaming somebody for doing something. So this comes with awareness. It's not an accusation. It's about just labeling something as violence. When you say the word violence, um, it has a an impact. Um, when somebody tells me, "Oh, I was just being passive aggressive," and it's like, hang on a minute here. When you say passive aggressive, you're trying to minimize it. Okay, you're still being aggressive, so that's a form of violence. So that changes the tone of the conversation, right? I tell a white lie. Well, if you're lying to somebody, you're doing that with intent to deceive somebody, which is a form of manipulation, which is a form of violence, and it changes the dynamic of it. You know, um, so that's why I use the word violence when I describe what we're talking about. But for me, um, having a former addict, long-term recovery, right? Um, now I can look back and my addiction was an attempt to alleviate pain, but it caused a lot of problems. It it's it put me um, when I was in my addiction. I alienated people. I hid my addiction from people. I deceived them. I lied to them. I put myself in positions to have bad things happen to me. Now I can look back and I can see that I was doing emotional violence to myself, not to beat myself up, but to explain it. And now I can be accountable for it. I can look back at it, and a lot of I'm going to say I'm going to say everything comes from dysfunctional family of origin, unresolved childhood trauma. My behavior as an adult stems from my childhood trauma, how I was emotionally violated, emotional violence that was done to me. Um, and one of the things that is emotional violence to a child is when the adult doesn't have the ability or was never taught, so they don't have the capacity to regulate their emotions. And then what they do is they transfer it onto the child. I can remember days where my mom was mad at me, and her solution to teach me how to be coerced into in the right behavior was not to talk to me for 3 days.
Wow.
And you know, the average person doesn't talk about that and see that as a form of violence, right? That form of violence is on par with being physically attacked, doing physical violence. In terms of being hit, having stuff thrown at you.
Well, because it's what you said earlier. It's like it's designed to cause an emotional response that leads toward, at least like in the case of you talking about your mom, excuse me, your mom, it leads toward the desired end to control.
Right, is to get me to comply with
Right,
somebody's wishes.
right. So
And
whether we get hit or whether we get the silent treatment, it still evokes a painful emotional response, and that's why we call that violence.
correct. So it's been an ongoing journey to discover, the impact of uh, and another form of violence is neglect, intentional neglect, which creates in a child an emotional response. They're terrified. They don't understand the complexities of the adult world, but neglect, physical, verbal abuse, just, you know, not getting enough sleep. There's another form of emotional violence is, you know, intentionally sleep depriving somebody, violating somebody's space. When, invading somebody's space is a form of emotional violence. Intentionally mean mugging somebody, a look. I do remember, my mom could look at me and it had an impact. And, you know, and it's like, well, holy smokes, But I thought that was normal. Um, but it still had the impact. She might as well have yelled at me because that was the same effect.
Right.
Um,
You still had an emotional response that was pain, fear, grief in that range.
yeah. So it's like, and then there's the verbal violence where, saying, how many times do I have to tell you, you're never going to amount to anything. You're stupid. You should know this by now. You're not a child anymore, right?
Oof, oof.
Uh, and that's a form of verbal violence because it's an intent to hurt you, to literally coerce you into behavior that the person doing it believes you should be doing it.
Right.
You know, I mean, nurturing is the exact opposite, which is, here, I see you don't, you're struggling with this. How about we spend some time on it and see if we can, y- I just want to spend some time with you here so we can, go over this versus, you're fucking stupid. How many times are you going to do this? And,
Go to your room till you figure it out.
which is emotional violence as well, because now I've been isolated, I've been separated from, and if you don't like this feeling, you need to figure this out so you don't have to go into that room and experience this. And it's just it, so giving some great examples. Now I'm all fired up here. Um, so the flip side of that is that I do the same thing to myself,
Exactly.
or I do it to I do it to people around me, um, you know, and it comes off with, what I've learned and experienced is what I project onto other people is my trauma as well. And I used to think people used to make excuses. Well, you're a human being, and you're going to make mistakes. And I translated that into that's a fucking excuse. You're just not fucking trying hard enough.
Because you're lazy, because you're stupid, because
It,
you're a cruel child, you're trying to hurt me.
so instead of that the voice coming from my parents, it I somehow became a ventriloquist, and now my mother is speaking through me in my voice.
Yep.
And the process, or what we're talking about here is to have an awareness that I am doing that to myself, and it's a form of emotional violence. But that voice in my head, it's not an audible. You can't. It's not. Nobody else hears it, right? But that's the trauma. That's the violence that I continue to do to myself because I haven't learned to nurture myself or become or make it a choice. There is a choice.
Well, I would actually suggest that we do this in part because we're addicted to it. It's not even that we don't know we have a choice, it's that in some bizarre way it feels good to do that to ourselves.
I really struggle with that one. Um, Being addicted to it, and it doesn't feel. You know, I lived through a 20 year addiction and stuff. And it's a horrible thing.
It is horrible.
And you know, and using for me, using the word that I liked it, um, that would, yeah, that's another topic. But I'm just saying, there's room for compassion in there,
Oh,
and
sure.
but the addiction is a form of violence to self and others because the behavior, it's an attempt to solve a problem that the child wasn't given the information or the experience to solve.
Correct.
And the addiction is an attempt to solve that problem.
Well, it would you be willing to consider it's an attempt to solve the problem by violently interceding something different from what would actually work? So if what would actually work would be to allow myself to complete an emotion, and instead I intervene with something else, then I've prevented that emotion from just completing, whether it's fear, grief, um, and that's exactly what happened to me as a little kid, is my emotions were never allowed to just flow.
Right. But that's you know, not to blame anybody or the parents,
Correct. That's just to account
right?
for it.
Right. Um, the word we're using here is the inability to do that. My solution is to put something in from the outside that has consequences.
Right.
And once I discover that this keeps me from feeling my pain, uh, I will continue to do that at all costs, which include, uh, my future, my freedom, my family, um, all those
My physical health.
physical health all go out the window. Um, and uh, you know, it is a form of violence. If you're an IV drug user, you're injecting a substance into your body that can lead to other medical issues, which is a form of violence to yourself. Um, but no blame, no judgment. I really have to emphasize that. When I can see it as a form of emotional violence that I'm doing to myself, that's the awareness. I can be accountable for it, and then I can create a new avenue for me to go down, which is to create an intention for what it is that I want instead. And how I don't do emotional violence to myself today. People ask me, "Don't you ever think about using again?" And I tell them it's just like, well, what I've learned is that avenue doesn't lead to where I want to go. I've been down that road and it's a dead end. From literally for some people, it is a dead end. But now, how do I nurture myself? I teach myself skills. Uh, I'm not powerless anymore. I am powerless over it, but I'm not helpless. That's the difference. I now have tools. I now know I can call people. I can go to a meeting. I can literally self-soothe, not self-medicate. I want to feel my feelings versus not feel my feelings. And that's the difference. That's how I'm stopping the violence to myself. And when I learn to stop the violence to myself, it automatically transitions into I stop the violence to others as well.
Yeah, somebody once said that recovery is learning how to shift from self-violence to self-nurturing,
Yeah.
or which is another definition of reparenting from my perspective.
Yeah. Or reframing, you know. It's changing the relations, doing something different.
Right.
Um, discovering that human beings require nurturing to grow and develop all these systems while they're young as children. And, the world's not perfect, so a lot of us didn't get a lot of the nurturing to develop. And it's not done on purpose. I haven't met anybody who purposely decides to screw their kids up. Uh, but there's a lot of times that it's the best they have with at the moment.
Partly because that's what they learned and they never learned anything different.
That's the tragedy that that we live in as human beings, as part of the human condition. What we're doing is we have awareness of say we have the awareness of what has happened. That's the awareness, and now as an adult, I'm no longer a victim like I was as a child. I have the wherewithal, the power to create the life that I want. The topic of violence is just another is another chapter in a long book of what I've learned about myself, and based on what I've learned, where do I want to go? So that's the reason I'm I want to talk about the violence, is because we may not see things as that. We don't define them as that. Negative self-talk, the part where I talk to myself, and it's like, I'm going to go over here and do this, or you're not good enough. You'll never be able to do that. Um, you know, those are forms of trauma from childhood, and they have an impact. But if I can see them as a it's a dysfunction, and it is violence, that voice in my head is consciously telling me I'm not good enough, which is not my voice, but it has become my voice. That's the original violence that was done to me, the emotional violence that I continue to perpetrate on myself because I don't know any better. I've never had this conversation. We never talked about, that voice. That voice is not uplifting. It's designed to put you down and create an emotional response so you feel less than, not good enough, and that's supposed to motivate you to greatness.
Yeah, how's that working for us?
Or it's just supposed to, motivate you. And then on the flip side, um, the parent or where I'm getting my information from, in childhood, um, that's been the model. If you want children to behave, you break their spirit. How do you do it? You know, what's that? Spare the child, or what is it? Something spare the rod, or
Spare the child, spoil the child, spare the rod.
so. So if you were to say that differently, is use the rod to not spoil the child? Use
Right.
some form of violence on the child to
Teach the
pull.
child, use the rod.
Exactly. So this is ingrained, right? So, um, and it has an impact. On what I hope we do here today is that we create awareness about our behavior and see it for what it is. And when I can see it for what it is, I have access to creating change.
Exactly.
Um,
Well, in the just in the last few minutes that we have remaining here, so let's just, would you be willing just to quickly summarize how do we now create that change?
uh, so through awareness, right? No blame, no judgment. Then I become accountable for what I'm doing. I'm doing them, my terms. I'm doing emotional violence to myself by um, repeating or engaging in violence to myself by telling myself I'm stupid, I'm not good enough, I'll never amount to anything. All right, take a deep breath, and now I can take some action here. I can make an evaluation. It's like, how is this working for me? Okay, it's not. All right, then what do I want to do instead? What experiment do I want to run here? Let's try something different. Let's make a decision. All right. So instead of doing emotional violence to myself by degrading myself, diminishing myself, what do I want to do? Okay. And through the accountability practice, the intention is I intend to be. What do you intend to be? I intend to be kind to myself. I intend to be forgiving, and I intend to be accepting. Or I intend to surrender to my emotional violence that I do to myself. That's taking action. And then I advocate for myself through repeating the intentions, knowing that I hold value as a human being, and nurture myself by continuing to create intentions, to forgive myself, and put myself in a community of people who support me in my journey and accept me and will listen to me. And it's really convoluted, you know. There's only two things in this world: a call for love uh, and an expression of love. And a lot of times in a lot of families, an expression of love is, you're no good. Something's wrong with you. You need to get your act together. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories about people being um, gaslighted to believe that my dad loved me enough to hit me so I wouldn't go around and make mistakes. So that individual has love confused with violence. And so what does he do to himself and the people around him? He loves himself by beating himself up, telling him he's worthless, and he treats his the people around him the same way.
You know what jumped in my mind as you were saying that was that old Johnny Cash song, "A Boy Named Sue." Well, I named you Sue so that you'd toughen up. And what did the guy do? He spent his whole time being in barroom brawls
And in prison,
at prison. So how'd that work for you?
right? That's how it is, you know. Violence is a symptom of an issue. It's it's literally a call for love.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our time together. So thanks, Dan, for this exploration of the kind of violence that we learn to do before we have a choice, and we learn to do it before we even have the ability to think. This happens from the moment we come home, maybe even when before we come home from the hospital, if that's where we were born. And so the accountability practice gives us a way to um, transform those old habits of self-violence into self-nurturing and self-compassion.
Yeah,
And it is a practice, my friends, and we do learn this practice in our group meetings. As Dan talked about, it's one of the places that we go to do our work whenever we feel overwhelmed by those voices. And so I invite you, if you haven't come to an accountability practice meeting, to consider doing it. We have 4 of them every week. Dan facilitates one on Monday night. I facilitate one on Wednesday afternoon. And I say night and afternoon, that's Pacific time. We're in the West Coast in California. And there's one on Thursday night, and then Saturday morning, there's a meeting facilitated by the guy that taught us all this stuff, John Donovan. And the information on those meetings and the specific times and the Zoom addresses will be at the end of the podcast. They're all on Zoom. So we invite you to consider joining us and learning about this practice. Learn how Dan and I did it. We went to meetings with John, and he taught us through repetition, through leading us to look at those voices, listen to them, uh, be with them, be in the emotional state that those voices generate. And as Dan said, to embrace them rather than fight them and let them teach us something. And by cracky, they have.
exactly.
So, any last thoughts before we wrap it up, Dan?
Thought came to my mind how early this begins, this coercion begins. There's a school of child rearing where people back in the day were taught to let the kid cry until he cries himself out, so he'll learn how to sleep through the night. That's a form of emotional violence at the extreme level, at the extreme level. And this has been practiced. So it starts early.
Yeah.
And I couldn't imagine, I could not imagine the fear and the stress that goes through that little baby who has no clue when it's crying for help and no one comes.
Yep.
My gut just is spinning. And that has been uh, taught to parents. Yeah. And
Well, and people wonder why we have wars.
uh, yes. So,
Yep. It goes to what you said a few minutes ago. It's everything's either a cry for love or an act of love. So as with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks, Dan, for your time and your thoughts. And again, everybody, please consider coming check out this work in one of our meetings. And with that, we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Marty.
Thanks.